U.S. President Trump said that Ukraine will feel a strengthening of its position. What exactly does he mean? Is his rhetoric towards Putin and Russia really changing? How can we assess the statements voiced? I am personally observing the situation and have participated in the broadcasts. A significant moment was the transfer of the Patriot system together with anti-missile missiles. As far as we can tell, we are talking about 17 to 18 missiles that are being prepared for shipment to Ukraine. Perhaps there will be more. The exact information is not specified. This is stated by Trump. The transfer of missiles and strike means was also discussed. The missiles in question have a range of up to 400 kilometers, and with modification, up to 1,000 kilometers. Given the public statements, such a development seems possible. The issue of sanctions was also touched upon. According to Trump, the U.S. intends to impose secondary restrictions against Russia and its trading partners if an agreement on Ukraine is not reached within 50 days. A 100% fee is mentioned, not a 500% fee. The difference between the two is not entirely clear, but additional applications are expected. This was said at a meeting with Mark Rutte, the head of NATO. This can be considered a significant departure from attempts to make concessions to the Kremlin. What is important for Ukraine is the transfer of weapons and the resumption of some of the supplies that were previously suspended.
Уже значительный шаг, как минимум для Украины существенная передача вооружений, возобновление части поставок, которых не было.
Plans include delivery of 150mm shells and HIMARS rockets, support that could impact the front in Ukraine. This does not mean an immediate escalation of the war, but such actions could have a serious impact on a number of key issues, especially on sensitive parts of the front where the Russian offensive continues. Although it is developing erratically and has not achieved its stated objectives in the first half of the summer. This phase ends tomorrow after 3.5 years. Trump mentions a 500% duty but says it wouldn't make sense under the new U.S. election law against Russia and its allies. In my view, such measures still make sense despite unclear details. Trump doesn't explain why 500% duties wouldn't work. I believe the higher the rate, the stronger the impact. Perhaps he assumes that the requirements for secondary sanctions will not be met. At the same time, duties of 100% may be taken more seriously by Moscow's partner countries and by Russia itself, as they are also subject to these restrictions. The current situation is markedly better than in the recent past, when Trump actually provided Putin with a political advance. This has been repeatedly discussed and recognized as a mistake. Months were lost during which Putin feigned a desire for peace. These illusions cost the lives of Ukrainians, and the necessary measures could have been taken much earlier.
Которые были даны Путину на то, чтобы изображать стремление к миру, они, унесли просто жизнь украинцев, и можно все это было делать и раньше.
It is not quite clear why the 50-day period should be granted. It has already been exhausted, and the question arises as to whether a new similar application with another countdown will not follow. 50 days is almost a month and a half, and it is important to understand what the purpose of such a time period is, for Moscow to gain time or for it to have time to sit down at the negotiating table. It is difficult to expect Moscow's immediate agreement to Trump's initiative. The reaction is likely to be restrained in the spirit of formulations like, "We will study the proposals, it is important," or "We are ready to present counter steps." All of this is on a familiar diplomatic level. It is important to avoid escalating the situation by rash actions related to the supply of new weapons to Ukraine or strengthening the flow of funds already available. The language of sanctions is not always effective in dialogue with Russia, but the known measures have an impact. Moscow will now take things much more seriously. It is likely to start an internal discussion about possible actions, including a 30-day formal ceasefire.
пойти ли на, например, 30-дневное прекращение огня, притворное, конечно, не настоящее.
Such steps may be aimed at calming the situation and creating the impression that concerns have been heard and taken into account. However, I personally doubt the sincerity of these intentions. Nevertheless, we cannot rule out the possibility that Moscow will take a tactical maneuver in the direction of demonstrating a peace-loving position. They may try to create the impression of readiness for more serious dialogue. However, statements about the need for a third round of talks with Ukraine seem unfounded if no concrete agreements have been reached so far. At this stage, the situation becomes noticeably more complicated. The key is to understand what the dynamics of Trump's actions will be and whether there will be a reversal of the previous strategy with a new temporary advance for Putin. I would recommend caution in assessments given the variety of events that have already taken place during this period.
Я бы осторожно сейчас подошел к оценке этой ситуации, потому что мы всякое видели за этот период.
Trump is undoubtedly an impulsive politician, but now it is important to watch the implementation of the steps already announced, especially on the issue of arms deliveries. If Ukraine starts receiving them, it could lead to a noticeable change on the front, where offensive actions have slowed down. If these measures aren't fully funded, their impact on the war may be limited. Still, actions against Russian aggression could benefit Ukraine. We must stay cautious, as Trump's approach has been inconsistent since his inauguration.
Все-таки осторожность я бы некоторую сохранял, потому что Трамп за эти месяцы после своей инаугурации много чего демонстрировал, и мы многое что видим.
In any case, these are optimistic statements. Here, a better picture is emerging than it was even a short while ago. We just have to let the situation develop in the necessary direction much more. That's what I would say. We have captured the highlights. You can leave your comments and opinions below this video. Don't forget to support Mark Feigin's analysis by liking it. Trump's statement was followed by his opinion about Putin. He called him a tough politician.
Марк Захарович, в продолжение заявления Трампа, также Трамп говорит, что Путин жесткий парень.
Trump claims he was the only one Putin couldn't fool, unlike Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Biden. According to him, the time for talk is over. It is time for action. This statement is interesting, especially in the context of possible backlash, escalation, and reaction from Russia and Putin personally. What scenarios are possible for Russia and Putin? How might events develop? And is there still a possibility that Putin will accept certain conditions and Trump will reconsider his statements?
На определенные условия согласится, и Трамп забудет свои слова.
Putin may take steps to demonstrate peaceful intentions, including possibly agreeing to Trump's proposal for a 30-day comprehensive ceasefire if Trump's actions have tangible consequences. The Russian side has lost about 100,000 troops since the beginning of the year in offensive operations, according to the Ryuta Live data. The tangible consequences of Trump's actions must be material for them to become an incentive to revise the strategy. In this case, Moscow will start discussions at the level of the general staff and other structures, and maneuvering will begin. The question will arise, how to act in a situation where resources are exhausted, military warehouses are burning, logistics are disrupted, and strikes continue in the rear. The Russian side faces the difficulties of offensive operations accompanied by significant personnel losses. The high expenditure of resources in assault operations exacerbates the overall situation. Tangible negative consequences are needed to change the nature of Putin's actions. In their absence, there is no incentive to revise the strategy. The situation is perceived as stable. Some say shelling Moscow, especially landmarks, will provoke retaliation. If the offensive stalls, what's the point of more attacks? It may be wiser to pause, simulate peace efforts, and avoid heavy losses without results.
Если, так сказать, затормозится наступление, а какой в нем смысл? Проще сидеть, стоять 30 дней, изображать мир, нежели расходовать личный состав и ничего не добиваться.
What matters to Putin are the real consequences, which can be an incentive to negotiate and seek compromise. Although internally he probably does not want the war to end, compelling circumstances may force him to change tactics and take other steps. Do you understand? And if in the aftermath, no, Putin won't do anything. That is, actions must have consequences. That's very important. Large-scale decisions and their full-scale implementation are necessary to achieve tangible consequences. Recently, the issue of Moscow's shelling has been actively discussed, as well as Trump's statements about the possibility of transferring long-range JASSM missiles capable of hitting targets up to 1,000 kilometers away to Ukraine. The statement is noteworthy. Earlier, it was about the transfer of 17 Patriot systems. Now the possibility of supplying long-range missiles is being discussed. This could be a deterrent for Russia, especially if such missiles are capable of reaching territories deep inside the country. The question is whether Putin takes this threat seriously and is willing to change his approach to the conflict. JASSM missiles pose a serious threat because of their characteristics. One of the modifications has a range of 370 kilometers, the other up to 1,000 kilometers. These systems are extremely difficult to intercept. Russian countermeasures are practically unable to neutralize them. Hitting a sensitive point with such a missile could seriously affect the course of the conflict, demotivating the continuation of hostilities. This is exactly what we are talking about. What is the point of continuing the war if, for example, the General Staff on Frunzenskaya Street no longer has one of its floors or an entire entranceway has been destroyed? If the structure on Lubyanka has disappeared, there are limited possibilities for action. It is impossible to use the atomic bomb and other resources have been exhausted. Ukraine has priority in air defense, unlike Russia. Western systems partly intercept Russian strikes while Russia lacks Patriots. Its missile defense, S-300 and S-400, is less effective as seen in Iran. This risks serious mistakes and losses, especially if Ukraine receives hundreds of long-range missiles. If such a missile hits the residents in Novoagorovo, it will change the nature of the war. You can play tough and say that it doesn't hurt or scare, but this is a completely different level of conflict. It is important to understand Putin wages war only against weaker opponents. He does not clash with equal or stronger forces. Putin started the war against Ukraine convinced of its weakness. He does not, as a matter of principle, enter into conflict with those who are equal or superior to him in strength. He has never once fought a stronger opponent, be it Georgia, Ukraine, or the forces opposing Assad in Syria. Putin has never entered a conflict with equal or stronger opponents. If Ukraine becomes comparable in military power, the point of continuing the war is lost, only losses. Moreover, ending the conflict without achieving the stated goals would create serious political problems for him. Putin may have no other choice. Modern missile systems pose a serious threat. They are extremely dangerous because of their powerful warheads, which can reach up to half a ton and are equipped with additional functional elements. Their effectiveness makes them particularly intimidating, and that is what is most feared. The reaction to the Taurus missiles was revealing. In Russian discourse, it is equated with German involvement in the conflict. Without German navigation and technical support, these missiles are unable to function, and their use on Russian territory is perceived as direct German involvement in military action. Trump is no longer seen as an aloof figure. America is now engaged in a military conflict. Challenges against the United States sound loud, but in the context of the thesis announced earlier, it is clear that Putin's Russia is not at war with stronger states. Russia won't use nuclear weapons against powers with similar arsenals, as retaliation is certain. Nuclear arms only make sense against countries without their own nuclear capabilities. Against the US, France, or the UK, use is pointless due to guaranteed retaliation. Using nuclear weapons today makes no sense. Retaliation is inevitable. Putin fights weaker foes, but Ukraine's modern missiles close the gap. If Ukraine declares itself nuclear capable, it would radically change the conflict's strategic landscape. If Ukraine is given such missiles, it will open access to new means of warfare. These technologies have never been supplied before, and their emergence will change the nature of the conflict. It will become qualitatively different, larger, and more serious.